The second aspect of the monastic spirit is a rule of life. I'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow, but in the Lindisfarne community we have a rule of life, which is our way of living. In brief, it's a balanced life of prayer, study, work and rest, and that's the kind of summary of it. It's more complex than that. We have a lot of understandings and disciplines that we do, but if you were to summarize, if you join the Lindisfarne community, what's your rule of life? It's a balanced life of prayer, study, work and rest. Now when you look at monastic movements historically, they all have a way of summarizing their rules. So you would see poverty, chastity and obedience, right? So you say to a Franciscan, what's your rule of life? It's poverty, chastity and obedience. The Benedictine tradition is, the summaries are a number if you look at the rule of Benedict. But you'll find pray and work. It's really important. If you say to a Benedictine, what's the whole ball of wax? What do you do? Well, we pray and work. The Northumbria community, which is a new monastic community in the UK, their summary is availability and vulnerability. And I've been in a lot of conversations with John Skinner in Turkey and talking to John about the beginnings of the new monasticism in Britain. And this was one of John's ideas when he and his friend Andy Rain were trying to work out in the early 1980s what would it mean to be new monastics. They came up with this idea. It's availability and it's vulnerability, and that's the way we're going to live. And so monasticism, the second aspect is there is a rule of life, and if you become associated with a community, it's because you share that same rule. So what is it that links us together as the Lindisfarne community? We have a rule. Now you've got to think outside the box when I say rule. It's not, you know, the way we use rule in everyday, you know, rules and regulations. The rule is a way. It's a path. It's a Tao. So what is the way of Lindisfarne, the Tao of Lindisfarne? It's to live this kind of balanced life. The third aspect of monasticism is a focus of spiritual disciplines. That there are certain things that you do when you are monastic. Now traditionally these have often been framed as renunciations, that you renounce wealth, that you renounce family, you renounce status, you renounce the city, you leave all the comforts of life and you go off into the desert, or you go and build your hut on an island in the middle of the Irish Sea or the North Sea or somewhere. And that has traditionally been a large part of monasticism. You renounce sexuality. Now I laying my cards on the table, I find those aspects of monasticism quite problematic, and I think some of them are problematic because they're rooted in the Christian sense, in a too deeply ingrained Augustinian distrust of creation, and I find that really problematic, and I find it's also rooted in a very contorted understanding of sexuality that also comes from the same stream, but I don't need to talk about that. I just find those things difficult. More positively, spiritual disciplines can be seen in terms of, as we are doing this evening, meditation and mindfulness and service and study and the practices of a particular tradition. Those are the monastic disciplines that are part of what it means to be a monastic. The fourth aspect of the spirit of monasticism are the rituals of a tradition. And when I read the history of monastics, they're all rooted in a tradition. Whether the tradition is Christian or Buddhist or Hindu or Taoist or a secular tradition, they're rooted in a tradition. And I think it's foolish to think, well, we don't need tradition. We can make our own way. We can plough our own furrow. It's foolish because there is no such thing as a disembodied existence. To be embodied, to live in a body, is to be part of a tradition. And it was the great mistake of the Enlightenment philosophers who thought, okay, we can dispense with tradition and ritual and all that kind of stuff of human beings before they're mature, and now that we're mature we can just go by pure reason and we can make our own way. Absolute nonsense. When they came up with any good ideas, they simply repeated the ideas of the past, even though they thought they were saying something novel. They weren't. But when they became detached from the anchor of a tradition, then it produced nihilism of the late 19th century and the disasters of the 20th century, which is a very broad sweeping statement, but I think it's a sustainable one if you want to talk about that. So for us, we are very clearly rooted in the Christian tradition. Now this also is a problem. In parts of the new monasticism with Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove and Shane Claiborne, they say it's really hard to be a Christian in America because so much that is now deeply ingrained in culture is actually antithetical to the way of Jesus, and it's hard to be a Christian. And sometimes you end up saying, and Scott did a very nice blog about this recently, that when you say I'm a Christian but not like those Christians, you know, and Scott's context was, you know, isn't it strange if you ever talk to a Baptist, they say I'm a Baptist but not like those Baptists. What's going on here? We can't escape from tradition. What it means to be part of a tradition is actually to be in dialogue with the tradition. And to be in dialogue with the tradition is to be in critique of the tradition itself. And that's how traditions grow and change. Now, it's conceivable that there does come a point when you so can't live with your tradition anymore that you change your tradition. And that is a very deeply psychological break and often involves quite a lot of psychological trauma. It's the kind of trauma that people go through when they change nationality. Because there's something very deeply ingrained about nationality, and even though you might not really agree with where you came from, when you change it to something else, there's this psychological trauma that takes place. It's what happens when people are converted in religion. If you are one thing, you convert to another, that is a deeply powerful psychological break. And it happens that at some points a tradition no longer works and you change it. But most of the time we don't. Most of the time what we do is we dialogue with the tradition, and we probably will still end up saying, well, yes, we're Christian, but when we say Christian we mean this and not this.